The spirit of the cemetery itself. This cemetery opened in 1787. Who was president in 1787? Think about it. Maybe, just maybe, George Washington, but maybe it was before Washington was president. I really should look that up and know. But this was opened by, and it was a land grant from the King of Spain to the Roman Catholic citizens of St. Genevieve. It didn't belong to the city, it didn't belong to the parish, it was to the Roman Catholic citizens of St. Genevieve. But it ended up not being just a Catholic cemetery, it was a place where everybody was buried. So there are Catholics, there are Protestants, there are French, there are German, there are people that were on their way to the gold rush out in California, and they died on the riverboats, and they would drop the bodies off on the landing with a note pinned to their chest saying, "This is so-and-so going to the gold rush." And we had that much information, and they're buried here. The Dr. Franklin II exploded in 1852, and the people in town went out and grabbed the dead bodies, and they're buried in the mass grave. And today we have people here portraying them. We have there's just a huge variety of people that are buried in this cemetery. And by 1882, it was full, because we have no map of this cemetery. People would come in and say, "I'm going to bury Grandma right there." And by 1882, every time they would open a grave, they would find bones. And they were terrified of finding cholera victims. So that was happening so much that they decided to close the cemetery in 1882. Well, Mrs. Valle wanted to be buried next to her husband, so she gave the land for the new cemetery so she could be buried next to her husband whenever she died. So she's the last burial in 1894, and she has the big pink stone up there on the hillside over there. So she's the last one to be buried here. Oh, I have a spot here that I can stand up in. So we'll see how that goes. But as you go around, as you look at the stones, some of them are in English, some of them are in French, some of them are in German, a couple of them are in Latin, and you'll find some in English too. just for a change of pace. But look at the languages that are represented there. Look at the dates on them, and look at the children. There are 3,000 to 5,000 people buried in this cemetery, and about a third of them are children under the age of 5. So, because when you say 3,000 to 5,000 people, and you look at the size of this cemetery, you think there can't be that many people buried here. But think of those are little graves, you know, that it takes up less space. So there are a lot of children that are buried in this cemetery. So you may go in any direction and see them in any order that you want, and they will continue to tell their stories over and over again. And please enjoy the evening, and thank goodness it's not raining.
I know.
My name is Genevieve Schwab, and I died during the cholera epidemic of 1854 at the age of 30. At 30 years of age, I was a woman well past my prime. The life expectancy of a woman in Missouri at that time was 39. I taught school here in St. Genevieve, and I never married. If I'd have married, I would no longer be able to teach school. That was the law in the country at that time. St. Genevieve, the epidemic took approximately 1/4 of the people, and cholera was a disease that was transmitted through the water. Many people brought their water into their home in a bucket that they brought in from the creek or a nearby stream, and most of the buckets were homemade, made of wood, and it was a place that germs just grew stronger and stronger. Many people used the same dipper or ladle to drink from. They didn't have individual utensils, and no one knew that you should boil the water before you drank it. Cholera was a disease that took people quickly. Most people died within 3 days. The first symptom was you were incredibly thirsty. So what did you do? You drank more water, more of the water that was making you ill. By day 2, you were probably struggling to raise your head from the bed, and by day 3, you were probably being carried out the door. The day Genevieve Schwab was buried here, 39 were buried. All died of cholera.
I'm Barbara Okenfuss. I represent the Germans buried here in the cemetery. I came over here as a teenager with my parents. They followed the advice of a man named Duden. He had lived in the St. Louis area. He was from Germany, and when we returned back to Germany, he wrote a book describing Missouri as the perfect place for the Germans who wish to emigrate to settle. The rolling hills remind you of home. He even specified that you don't want to go too far north. It gets too cold in the wintertime. And don't go too far south. It's too hot in the summertime. He just neglected to mention we have both. Anyway, my husband also came from Germany as a young man. His uncle paid his way. His uncle wrote the last encyclopedia of plants, animals, and minerals. Anyway, we met here. We had 11 children. 4 of my little girls are buried in this cemetery. I don't know exactly where they were buried because back then most people marked graves with wooden crosses, and the wooden crosses are long gone. They died of cholera, which is a very common cause of death for young ones. 7 of my children lived to adulthood, and some of my sons had stores here in town. My son Henry was a tinsmith. He put the tin roofs that you see in St. Genevieve on the houses. Another son was a plumber and had an appliance store, and another son was a carpenter. So we made our mark in early St. Genevieve.
You've seen a lot of graves here tonight, but we represent a group of people that don't have a tombstone to mark our grave. In fact, we represent a group of people that died tragically on a steamboat accident just 4 miles north of here near Turkey Island.
It was August 22nd of 1852.
My wife and I were new grandparents, and we were making our way to Louisville, Kentucky to meet our new grandson who had just been born a couple of months prior. So we purchased tickets aboard to travel by steamboat, and the name of the boat we were traveling with was called the Dr. Franklin II, which I thought to myself was an odd name to call a boat.
Yeah. Well, it was a beautiful day to travel. It was about 2 o'clock when we left St. Louis, and Captain Harkins, he was sick, so he stayed on shore, but the clerk, Mr. Montgomery, he told us that the ship was, or the boat, it's not a ship, the boat was built just 4 years earlier in 1848 in West Virginia.
The average speed of the Dr. Franklin II was about 7 miles an hour, and while it's not a fast way to travel, it was certainly a lot smoother than going by horseback. So needless to say, we had a lot of time to meet our fellow passengers.
One of those was an author by the name of Ned Buntline. Have you ever heard of him? Well, we got to travel with him. He had some outlandish stories.
He was quite the character. We had never read any of his dime novels, as they call them, but he told us this story about how he single-handedly captured 2 murderers and got a $600 reward for it. So we weren't sure whether he was telling the truth or whether this was one of his stories.
Yeah.
So anyway, we slowly made our way down the river and the sun began to set. It was a lovely evening, so we decided that we were going to sit out on the deck and watch the sunset and watch the scenery go by. It was a lot cooler than going back to our cabin.
Well, that was the worst decision we could have made. We never did make it to see our grandson. About 11 p.m. that night, we were getting ready to come into St. Genevieve, and the flue collapsed on the starboard side of the boat, and it scalded us along with about 40 other passengers that were on deck.
Our boat was towed into St. Genevieve, where the townspeople saw a terrible sight of dead and dying passengers and crew. They brought us here and buried us here in this cemetery in a mass grave, and to this day no one is quite sure where our bodies are located.
And you were from St. Louis?
Yeah. There were people traveling. Most of the passengers on the ship were from different places up and down the Mississippi. A lot of business people, and
The boat was on its way to Louisville.
Okay.
Yeah. But then after they towed it to St. Genevieve, then a few months later it was towed to St. Louis, where it was set on fire and destroyed. But there's actually a picture of it that you can see online. If you search Dr. Franklin II, you can find a picture of the boat.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. And there's a list of the passengers that were killed.
Okay. Very interesting.
thank you for listening to our
Thank you.
story.
Thank you.
I am Francois Janis. I am the proprietor of the Green Tree Tavern, or I once was. I was born in Kaskaskia, which at that time was on the other side of the Mississippi River. And although later years I would have holdings on this side of the river. But there seems to be some confusion on exactly when that was. Now, some sources say that I was born in 1763. If this is true, that I was born a Frenchman. But other sources say I was born in 1764. If this is true, then I was born an Englishman. Because in 1764, France had to give up all the land west of the Mississippi River, east of the Mississippi River, to England as a result of the French and Indian War. And so many of the French that were on that side of the river crossed over to this side and moved their homes into what they thought was France. But we would not find out for many years later that it wasn't France, because in 1763, France had made a secret treaty with Spain, giving to Spain all the land west of the Mississippi River, so they wouldn't lose it to the English because of the war. In 1790, my father, Nicholas Genet, came across, and he built a home just on the south side of the Gabourey, on the road from here to New Bourbon, now called St. Mary's Road. And a few years later, he decided that he couldn't take care of his holdings much longer, and so he asked me to come over with my family from Kaskaskia, and he would give me his home and his property as long as I took care of him for the rest of his life. You see, being his youngest child, I was his Social Security. That's why they had lots of children. In those days, your youngest children were expected to take care of you until you die, but then they got your property. That's how, you know, unless you had other arrangements with the other children. So I took over and took care of my father. Now, of course, this was Spanish territory, and my plan was to open a tavern on that site so that travelers would have a place for repose and refreshment. But the Spanish commandant here would refuse me a license because he said we already had enough taverns in St. Genevieve. There were already 2. But then, in 1804, news arrived that changed everything. The United States purchased all that land from France. And so we were now going to be part of the United States. They even sent a captain of United States artillery from Cahokia to St. Louis to take possession of all of Upper Louisiana for the Americans. And so he crossed the river and he went to the Spanish commandant, the lieutenant governor of Upper Louisiana, Odile Valle, and he presented himself. He says, I have come to take Louisiana for the United States. And Odile Valle, sitting in his chair looking over his spectacles, looked at the captain. He says, well, that's all good and well, but I can't give it to you. I have to give it back to the French first. You see, in 1800, Napoleon Bonaparte had taken Louisiana back. And then in 3 short years, sold us to the Americans. But the French had never come to take possession, and so the Spanish are still running things as usual, as nothing had ever happened. And so letters started flying around the world from St. Louis to Washington to Paris to New Orleans. And finally a letter arrives in St. Louis addressed to Captain Amos Stoddard of the United States Artillery. And it was from Napoleon Bonaparte saying, we name you as our emissary with full powers to accept Louisiana in our name. And so, as I was told later on by someone who watched it, on the 9th of March of 1804, the Spanish soldiers lined up at the fort that where 4th and Walnut is today, and they marched down Walnut Street past the old church down until in front of the Spanish government house. And they lined up on the street there on 1st Street, and they lowered the Spanish flag, and they raised the French flag. And then they all went home. And so the next morning, again, the Spanish soldiers lined up at the fort. They marched down Walnut Street down to the commandant's government's house on 1st and Walnut there, and they lowered the French flag, and they raised the stars and stripes, and now we've all become good Americans. And so I took advantage of the change in powers, and I opened up my tavern, which I named the Green Tree Tavern, because as I understand from folks from Philadelphia, that was a sign to the Americans that this was a place of repose and good, fine service and food. And so when you were traveling, if you looked for a green tree, that was like the Holiday Inn. And so at my establishment, you could find bone tobacco and good spirits as well as good food. An English traveler wrote of his experience at the Green Tree. He said, it was run by a lively little Frenchman. And then he spent the next paragraph praising my wife Pélagie's coffee. He said it was the best he'd had since New Orleans. In 1734, I passed away, but don't worry, it wasn't contagious. And so here I rest, except for once a year when I can come out and meet folks like you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
I'm the spirit of Odile Valle, and I was born in 1805, and my maiden name was Odile Dupret. My parents were merchants, and they were also lead miners, and wealthy enough to leave me a stipend for myself, which made me a kind of a wealthy woman at that time, because I didn't have to depend. Most women had to depend on their husbands for their sustenance, but I had enough money in my own that I think I could have survived on my own. And when I was 17, I married Felix Valle, who's buried here too. But Felix was a very wealthy merchant at that time, and he was very much into philanthropy for the city. he tried to bring teachers into the city to teach here. Well, this was wilderness, and most teachers didn't want to be here. They wanted to be in cities or in more developed areas. But he tried to get teachers here. He opted to get sidewalks in the city where people could, instead of walking in the mud, they could walk on sidewalks. So he was very philanthropic. As I said, I was 17 when I married him, and a year later we had our first and only child, Louis. Louis died as a young man of 33, never marrying, so we had no grandchildren. We had lots of nieces and nephews, but no direct heirs. And just before that time, just when Louis was about a year old, we bought a house just down the street right here, just down Merchant Street, at 2nd and Merchant Street, a beautiful stone house that was used to house a business on one side and our residence on the other side. And we ran a business there. Felix' partner was Pierre Menard from across the river from in Fort Kaskaskia. And our store was known as Menard and Valle Trading Firm. And we ran a store there until about 1830. When Pierre Menard died, and at that time Felix decided to close the store and go out of the mercantile business. And Felix died when he was 77 in 1877. And
That's a long life.
yes, a long life. And but I continued to live on. I lived 12 more years, but during that time they closed the cemetery. They closed it in 1881. They said it was a health hazard and closed the store. And they said no more burials here. So I wanted to be buried next to Felix, so I made the city an offer they couldn't refuse. I told them I'd give them a tract of land on the outskirts of town for a new cemetery if I could be buried next to Felix. And they agreed, so I was the last burial in the cemetery here.
Wow.
At the age of 8, his father decided that
It's, yes. But they were a very wealthy person, and even after Felix's death, I had enough money. He left me a very wealthy widow, and I had my own money too. So I gave 3/4 of the money that it took to build the big Catholic church that you see on the corner up there.
Okay.
he said when he arrived, all
I
the
felt I could do something with my money.
Assuming at some point.
Do you have any questions that you'd like to ask of me?
Interesting. When you don't, go ahead, Josh.
he was known.
I've heard of that Pierre Menard. I went to his house years ago.
Yes, it's still there. Yes, it's an Illinois State Historic Site. It's a lovely house. He was a wealthy person too. He dealt with the Indians in the fur trade a lot. That was what his contribution to Felix and their alliance.
When you donated money to build the church, did you build the church? Did you have the church built?
Yes, they built
So
it.
that you did that with your money?
Yes, I just gave them the money because they needed say one son, and I gave them 3/4 of the money that they needed to build
It
it.
was late in the day, and I took one look at it.
You got to see it finally?
I did.
Okay. And what year was that?
That was probably 1881 or 2, something, 81 to 82, something like that. It was latter part of the 1880s.
Of course, he put on his best general.
So when you died and before you got buried here, the church was done,
Yes.
and did you have your funeral service in the church?
Yes.
Wow. So were you the first?
No.
No? Okay.
But I was the last.
Yeah, you were the last to be buried here. Because, yeah.
And they had the new cemetery, which is just on the outskirts. I think there's a football field there and something right there now.
Yeah. Yeah, interesting.
Is your store still the store?
It's part of the Felix Valley State Historic Site
Okay,
now.
I've been
and
in
it
the
is
store
a
before. Yep, I've been in your store.
Yes,
Very nice store.
yes. It was a very nice store.
I learned that they made toothbrushes out of pig's hair there.
Yes, and
Okay.
a horse bristles.
Yes.
Interesting.
So be very careful. It's very ruddy here.
Okay.
The molds have been very busy.
Au revoir. Merci. Go. Bonsoir, madame. Madame. Comment ça va?
Oh, comment ça va?
C'est bon.
Exactement, monsieur.
I only know, quel âge as-tu? Comment ça s'appelle? I don't know, I'll look.
Quel âge as-tu? Moi, j'ai 89 ans. Puis, je suis mort. Vous connaissez?
Me?
Yes.
Angelique.
Angélique. Oh.
Angelique. I took French in high school.
Tu t'appelles Angélique.
Okay.
Je m'appelle Jean-Baptiste Valle.
Jim?
Jean-Baptiste. Ah, you know the Bible? Oui. Jean le Baptiste. Je suis Jean-Baptiste.
Okay.
Je suis le dernier commandant de la poste de Saint-Geneviève. When the Americans, they purchase all the territory to the west, and they arrive here, and that's when they appoint me as the commandant to the poste. Mon père et mon frère, commandant de Saint-Geneviève, et puis moi. J'ai ma femme, Marie, Jean, Barbeau, ma femme. Vous connaissez ma femme?
Your mom?
Non.
No, not your mom.
Your wife.
Exactement. Et ensemble, nous avons 4 fils. 4 fils.
4.
Exactement. Jean-Baptiste Valle, fils. François Baptiste, Louis Valle et Félix Valle. 1, 2, 3, 4. Ah, exactement.
Yep.
Félix, François, Louis et Jean-Baptiste aussi. 4 fils. Ah, avez-vous visité ma maison dans le village? Ma maison?
Your house in the village.
Avez-vous visité?
Have I visited?
Exactement.
Yes. I believe I've been in that one.
Parfait. C'est une grande maison, très grande,
Big. Yeah.
très élégante.
Elegant. Yeah.
C'est ma maison.
That's your house.
Oui. Et ma jardin autour de la maison. Le jardin.
The garden.
Exactement.
Okay.
Un jardin est une vergère avec les arbres.
Trees.
Arbres de fruits.
Oh, okay.
Exactement. Les pommes. Le poire aussi. Vergère. Et aussi un jardin d'agrément avec les fleurs. Les roses. Beaucoup de roses. Vous connaissez? C'est bon. Bonsoir, monsieur. Madame, vous parlez français? Non?
No.
Je ne parle pas anglais.
Je ne comprends pas.
Bonsoir and merci beaucoup for visiting me today. My name is Marie Villars, and I was born May 20 of 1790, and I died May 3rd of 1846. So I lived in town for 56 years, and I was never married. My mother was Marie Louise Valle, and her father was Francois Valle, and he was commandant in the militia in the old town. My father was Louis de Villars. His father was Louis de Villars, and he too was a commandant in the militia of the old town of St. Genevieve. I had one brother and 3 sisters. My brother Joseph married Vital, St. Jim Beauvais' niece. It was Eleanor St. Jim Beauvais. And Vital is here this evening, so if you choose to speak to him, he can tell you a lot more about his being a wealthy merchant. He did a lot of commerce between Kaskaskia and St. Jim. My sister Marie Mathilda married Philippe Charles de Hall de Lazus, or de Lazus, depending on how you pronounce it. His father was Pierre Charles de Hall de Lazus de Louisière. He was commandant in the town of Nouvelle Bourbon. He had a son, Charles Carlos de Hall de Lazus, and Charles was the last commandant and the last lieutenant governor of the Upper Louisiana Territory, 1799 to 1803. So we speculate he probably met Thomas Jefferson and Lewis and Clark, or at least we hope he did. I had a sister, Euphrosyne, and we like to call her Eugenia, and she married John Price. John came here from Kentucky, and he built the old brick. And then I had a sister, Marcelite. And she married Joseph Herditch, who's buried right behind you, with his sons on either side. Joseph was a Swiss immigrant, and he was also an educator and wealthy. He came to town in 1810. He built the school of the Asylum. It was located on the river Oxfoss Creek. The interesting thing was he taught in a very radical method for the time called the Pestalozzi method. And he believed that students could learn more by nature, and he took them on nature walks. He gained a lot of popularity, and he was chosen to become the first warden of the first Masonic Lodge west of the Mississippi, and it was called the Louisiana number 109, and meetings were held in the Janis Ziegler Green Tree Tavern. Then in 1833, Governor Dunklin decided to form a commission to start the first public school system in the state of Missouri, and he asked Joseph to head up that commission. So there you have it.
Wow.
Quite a family.
Yes.
Questions?
So I portray Marie Ren, Julie Barbeau Janis, and Janis is Janis. And so I was born in Prairie du Rocher and to the Barbeau family, which was a very prominent family there. Our father was the commandant and captain of the militia in his time, and he had 5 daughters, myself included, and 1 son. And our brother followed in our father's footsteps and became the commandant, and in his turn, instead of being the captain of the militia, he was known as the Justice of the Peace. So it was a little bit later period for him. So at any rate, I married at the age of 17, and my husband was 22 when we married. When we first married, we lived with my family, the Barbeau family, in Prairie du Rocher for a few years, and then we moved to Kaskaskia. So here we go to the geography lesson. We lived in Kaskaskia for a few years, and then my father-in-law, who was Nicholas Janis, built the Green Tree Tavern. If you heard of that. So it's on St. Mary's Road. It is our oldest vertical log building here in St. Genevieve. And so it was built in 1791 to something like that. The family that built it, the Janis family, came here from Quebec, and they were aubergistes in Quebec, which would be to us like a bed and breakfast. And so the building that they built, which is still standing, is known to us as the Green Tree Tavern, and it was the first overnight accommodation with also had a restaurant or tavern inside. So when we moved here, I already had 4 children, and then after we moved here, I had 5 more children. So we had 9 altogether that lived, and at the time that I died, I was only 51, and I had a 5-year-old child. So I think I probably died of exhaustion. I had 9 children under the age of 5. And my husband lived to the age of 78. And both of those seem really young to us, but the good news is of our 9 children, 5 of them made it to live into their 80s and 90s. So that's pretty good for the 1700s, early 1800s. And our youngest son, Pierre, turns out that he was the great-great-great-grandfather of the singer that you know as Melissa Etheridge.
Oh, wow.
So when they did, in that show, Who Do You Think You Are, they did her family history. They brought her here to St. Genevieve and into the courthouse, and we know the gentleman who took her into the courthouse was all very hush-hush because, nobody could know. So they looked down through all of the, the logs and the records, and they said, look, here is the name of your 5 times great-grandfather, Nicholas Janis, who came here
from Canada, built the building that we today know as the Green Tree Tavern. It's still standing. And she was just blown away, and they took her down to see the Green Tree Tavern, and yeah, so pretty cool story, neat connection of the present to the past. So, and I'm not buried here. We don't know where I was buried. There are more than 5,000 people buried, and we don't know where all the graves are. So I just picked this spot as a good spot to stand and tell my story.
Okay. Yes, my name's Louis Bolduc. I was born in Saint Joachim, which was in Canada, was in Quebec. That area was, at the time, was known as New France because a lot of French people moved from France there to kind of come to the new country. During the French and Indian War, my town was totally decimated. And that was around the 1760s. I came down here. And that's where I met my first wife, and we married. I was illiterate. I never learned, my whole life, I never learned to read nor write. And yet I became a very prominent business person in a very prominent city of St. Genevieve. When I met my first wife, we moved to Old Town, which was the original St. Genevieve, which is about 3.5 miles from here, along the river. And that river flooded a lot. And ultimately, I was one of the townspeople that voted to move the town here. We did, Agatha, my first wife, and I did have a house there. I built a house there. And once the flooding and I moved up here, we were able to salvage, I was able to salvage a good portion of the stuff from the old house. I was able to get some of the furniture and some of the logs. You didn't want to waste anything back then. So I grabbed that stuff, and some of that is used in the new house. In fact, one of the reasons it's a little hard to date the house here is because there is timber and some supplies that were used in the old house originally. But during that time, I really got involved in a lot of business transactions. I ended up owning lead mines. I owned farmland. I bought and sold. I would go to New Orleans a lot to buy goods and then come up here and sell it in this area. During the height of my life, I had 21 slaves. When I died in 1815, I still had 12 slaves. I had $10,000 in cash, and I had a number of other holdings. But you have to remember, $10,000 in cash in 1815 was a lot of money. So I really, for a person who was really not educated at all, I had a lot of business acumen and was really able to become a prominent citizen of St. Genevieve. We built the new home. The new home is really a great example of French Creole. It was 1,200 square feet, which is considered huge for the time. Most homes back then were 600 square feet, 500 square feet, very, very small. So this was really quite large. The valets were wealthier than we were, but we ran in those circles together. I traveled a lot, so I was out of town a lot. New Orleans was kind of the area of commerce, so I was going down to New Orleans a lot. You have to remember, going down river to New Orleans doesn't take very long, but going back up river takes a long time. So I could be gone for weeks and months at a time. And then do you want to talk a little bit about both my wives, Agatha and Marie?
Agatha, his first wife, was from a wealthy family in Kaskaskia and actually died at the original site of St. Genevieve, so to speak. The flood that convinced everyone to move everything to this location took, maybe I should back up and tell you. She had 4 children, the oldest being a daughter named Elizabeth, the second a son who lived to a young adulthood but died before his parents, and then there were 2 infant babies that died at birth. The second infant was my death also. I died also at the baby's birth, and I was buried, but in that flood, we have no idea where my remains are. They washed down the river with that flood. And Louis actually was buried here. We're not real sure where, but we know that his remains were moved to the new cemetery. So Agatha was down the river somewhere. And when she died, Louis was out of town and had been in town for a very long time, and he had no idea that she had given birth, nor died, or had been buried. And he gets back into town, and there are 3 surviving children that need a parent, and he quickly marries a young woman, 17 years younger than himself. And she was 4 months pregnant at the time, which wasn't unusual. They were French. It wasn't prudish. There was nothing wrong with being pregnant before you married. They would move in together and wait until the priest was in town to perform the service. So Marie had a number of infants that died of birth, but she did aid in raising those 3 other children. There was a problem with the oldest one, Elizabeth, who is the only one that survived her father's death, and was a teenage girl, and stepmom. It didn't work well, so it wasn't uncommon back then. They did ship her off to her godfather, and the agreement was that he would raise her until she married. And it was perfect timing. They were separated long enough that they rekindled their relationship. Her stepmother, Marie, and Elizabeth rekindled their relationship, and then remained very close for the rest of both of their lives. Elizabeth, of course, married, had children, and their descendants did live in the Bolduc home until 1949. So there was a long heritage of the Bolduc family in that home. They had remodeled it some, and they had they built a breezeway because they created a school. And
that was later. Yeah,
much later. The descendants did, not
Right.
Elizabeth, but the family lived there for a very long time. And back to the house here, and as he said, they rebuilt it. And have you been in the home? And did they point out the piece of furniture that had the watermark? That piece of furniture had been in the original home, and it showed the high watermark from the flood that pretty much decimated the town, and eventually it moved here. But it's interesting to see that piece of furniture is very old. Most everything in there is original to the home.
Mm-hmm.
So, and it's the French colonial, they lived out on their porch because summers were so hot. They slept out on their porch. They ate out on their porch. He did business out on the porch.
His scribe's desk is still there.
Still there, because he couldn't write, but he was a brilliant businessman. Absolutely.
So he had someone
brilliant.
that would really keep the books for him.
Yeah, hence all the money he made and the prominence that he achieved in the area. And
so that's the life of the Bolducs?
Yeah.
Any questions or?
Bonjour. You speak English, by the way? Do you know who I am?
No. You didn't introduce yourself earlier.
Oh, okay.
We saw you at the ballet.
Do you know who I am? No? Well, then I must say that Dr. Carl Ekberg, in his book, Colonial St. Genevieve, was correct when he described me as a virtual unknown. My name is Francois Leclere, and I came to St. Genevieve for a reason in 1770. I came here to serve as the secretary and the scribe for the wealthiest and the most powerful man in Upper Louisiana, a man by the name of Francois Valle. I come from a small town in New France. Does anybody know when I say New France, I'm talking about
Canada?
Canada, yes. I come from, more specifically, Quebec. Cap-Santé, a small town of 2,000 people in Quebec, Canada. Again, I came here for a reason. I came here in 1770 to be the secretary, the scribe for Francois Valle. I'm the one responsible for thousands of pages of documents that you're going to find in the courthouse here in St. Genevieve, and also in the vaults of Madrid, Spain, since of course we were a Spanish territory at the time. And I wrote all these documents, and I was educated. Francois Valle was not. In fact, hardly anybody in St. Genevieve was educated at the time. In fact, whenever Francois Valle would write his name after I would prepare the document, he would write the word Valle on it. I would come behind and write Francois in front of his name, Valle. So all the documents show two different kinds of handwriting, and that's the reason why. Again, he was illiterate. Anyway, in 1776, I married the niece of Francois Valle. I married Marie-Louise Valle. And we had 3 sons. Our first son was born in 1778, and we named him Francois. He died a month before his 3rd birthday. 1780, we had a second son. We named him Louis, after the King of France at the time. And then in 1782, we had a 3rd son, and we named him Francois. So we lived in the old town of St. Genevieve, which is about 3 miles downriver of the current location. The floods came in the 1780s and dispersed the town in 3 different directions. There was a group that went down south by the Saline Creek where they mined the salt. There was a group that went to the bluffs overlooking the old town. And then there was another group that came between the Gabourys, the creeks, and that's the current location of St. Genevieve. The Lecleres, we settled on the bluffs overlooking the old town. In 1789, I wrote my will. I wrote everybody's will. I was the scribe. And in the will, this was June of 1789, I wrote that I knew death was coming, but know not when. Therefore, I am writing my will. And in the will, it was unique for French custom because usually the French died, they left half to their spouse, and then the other half was divided up amongst the children. Well, with my will, I left everything to my wife, Marie-Louise Valle, and in that will I say because we accumulated our wealth together. And then we left 1,500 livres to each son when they turned 18. So 1789, September, I passed away. I was buried in the old town of St. Genevieve. In 1792, I was exhumed and reburied here. The cemetery had opened in 1787, and then I was exhumed and brought back in 1792. My wife knew that with the constant floods that I probably would be washed away. And that was very uncommon to exhume back in those days, but it happened with me. And it's a French custom that every time there is a death, that they would do a respectful invasion of the home and do an estate inventory. But that was usually happened the day after the death. But in my case, the estate inventory was not compiled until 1793. Now, why would they wait that long to do my estate inventory? I was the scribe. So there was nobody to do the estate inventory because I was the only educated man and capable of doing it. So come 1793, there was a man by the name of Pratt who became the notary of St. Genevieve. So he did our estate inventory in 1793. On that estate inventory, our value of all our property was 53,000 livres, which translates to about $530,000 at the time, 1780s, 1790s. $530,000 was a lot of money. So we were very wealthy. We were very, very wealthy. Yes, we were. But can you tell me what the most valuable asset on that estate inventory was? It was our slaves. Our slaves, there were 9 of them, they made up 40% of the estate. The second most valuable asset, ratafia, which is a sweet wine, rum, wine. That was the second most valuable asset on our estate.
Did you have a winery then?
Pardon?
Did you have a winery?
We had grapes, not a winery.
We didn't call it a winery.
We had wine also, but we had the ratafia was was top shelf. It was very, exquisite. Anyway, also on that estate inventory, I mentioned in my will that I was leaving everything to my wife since we accumulated our wealth together. Well, on this estate inventory, there were approximately 1,300 awns of material. An awn is an arm's length, French term for measurement. So we had 1,300 yards, approximately a mile worth of material. So my wife, of course, with all the needles on the estate inventory and bed, she was a seamstress, along with, I believe, the youngest slave, Mary, who was also buried with us. On the estate inventory, again, she was a seamstress and had all this material. There were material on there from like 25 different kinds of material, corduroy and Swiss and English, from all kinds of different places. That was again on the estate inventory. Now,
is this your family plot?
This is my family plot. There are 4 generations of Lecleres buried here. My son, I mentioned, my youngest son, Francois, this is his grave. He died in 1829. His wife, Félicité Saint-Gemme de Beauvais, the daughter of Vital Beauvais, she's buried here. She died in 1824. Their daughter, their oldest daughter, Decille, is this tall tombstone. She died, I believe, in 1870s. And then her son, who is usually here, the lieutenant colonel, his name was James Felix Saint Gemme de Beauvais. He changed his name to Felix St. James for political reasons. He was lieutenant colonel in the Union Army, and he died at the Battle of Shiloh in 1862 and then was brought back. So there are 4 generations of Lecleres buried here.
What's your slave?
I'm not sure. Not all.
Where's your marker?
There are 11. I'm not here either. My wife and I, neither one are marked. Probably because they used wood. I don't understand why Marie Louise, my wife, doesn't have a tombstone, because she died in 1825, but there's no tombstone, so I don't understand. But these are children, 3 children of Decille and Augustin Beauvais. 3 of their children are buried here. This is in memory of Diana Marie, one of their daughters, and her infant daughter, who married Michael Brendamore Menard here in St. Genevieve. Now, Michael Brendamore Menard is the founder of Galveston, Texas. And Diana Marie and the infant daughter were on their way to Galveston, and they died in the Gulf of Cholera in 1833. So that is not someone buried there, but that's in memory of. Again, 4 generations of the Lecleres buried here. So, and I want to thank you for stopping and visiting with me. And if you come back next year or another year down the road, let me know that you heard my story, because I can tell you about the 3rd generation of the Lecleres that went to Galveston. That's a pretty interesting story with them too.
Thank you.
Thank you.
St. Gemme Beauvais. My family name is St. Gemme, and our family originally was from the city of Beauvais, which is about 55 miles northwest of Paris. And the family came and moved to Canada, and then my father, Jean-Baptiste, moved from Canada down to Kaskaskia, where I was born in 1739. In 1775, I married my wife Félicité. She was a Janis. Her father built the Green Tree Tavern, which will be part of the National Park here. Yeah, oh, you already, yeah, okay. Well, Félicité was Mr. Janis' daughter, and we married in 1775. I was 13 years older than she, but a good catch. And we moved to St. Genevieve in 1787. The English were now over on the east side, and we didn't quite get along with the English. And I think pretty much none of the French did. A lot of them moved to Togo here or other areas. But anyway, my brother is also Jean Baptiste. And I moved to St. Genevieve, and I built a house which is still standing down on Main Street. It's catty corner from the Audubon restaurant, and my brother built the Amro House, which is down on St. Mary's Road and will be part of the National Park also. So all those houses are still standing there. In 1793, a judge in Pittsburgh decided he wanted his 7-year-old son. The judge had just gotten married again. His first wife died. He was married again. He wanted his 7-year-old son to learn French and French customs. And so he sent them with boatmen down the Ohio River and on a path up to St. Genevieve from the area across the river from Cairo, Illinois. And you can imagine it was a pretty dangerous trip at that time for a 7-year-old boy. And he arrived on our doorstep, and my wife found out he could speak no English, but she managed to find out that he had never been baptized. And his Henry, the little boy's name, Henry Murray Brackenridge, as he said, she didn't want him this heathen sleeping with her children, so she sent him, she marched him up to the rectory to Father Maxwell and had him baptized. But anyway, Henry stayed with us for 5 years, and the important part about that is that later in life he wrote about his life up to the time when he was about 25 or 26 years old, and he describes living with the Beauvais, living with us, and his life in St. Genevieve, which was about the best description we have of St. Genevieve in the 1790s. He talks about Mr. Beauvais as having kind of heavy jowls because he always had a pipe in his mouth except when he was eating. And Mrs. Beauvais was rather stout, rather heavyset, and very loving mother, but rather hard on the slaves. The house help, we had about 22 slaves. He talks about celebrations like Christmas. He talks about what they had to eat, the fact that their house had a large garden behind. The French ate a lot of vegetables. He says mostly it was soups and fricassees is what they had for meals. And he talks about what Christmas Eve was like. Or Sundays, they had balls on Sundays where the children would learn to dance and I think for deportment and that sort of thing. And it's a really interesting description. One of the funnier things that he says is that when he was in school, he won the top prize for grammar, and he's going to school with all these French kids, and he gets the prize for French grammar. And the award was a children's tea set, so they assumed that a girl was going to win the award. So Charles gave it to Zuzu, which was their youngest child. And we had 16 children. At least four of them died in infancy. So, but anyway, Zuzu was the youngest, and he gave her the tea set. And years later, he went back to Baltimore in Pittsburgh and then Baltimore and got a law degree like his father and was a member of the bar, but he decided he didn't want to go into law. So he decided, he took a journey and he came back down the Ohio River once again with an Irishman, and the Irishman was going to St. Louis, and Henry came up the path, stayed in St. Genevieve, stayed with my wife's family at the Green Tree Tavern, and then was here for Zuzu's. Found out that the next day Zuzu was getting married, and went to the Beauvais house. Mrs. Beauvais recognized him, and Zuzu went and got the tea set that had been given to her years and years before. So,
thank you.
You're welcome.
Good evening. Welcome. I am John Scott, Missouri's first U.S. Congressman. I was born in 1782 in Virginia. I came by way of Vincennes, Indiana. I was educated at Princeton, became a lawyer, and I opened up a law practice here in St. Genevieve. In the early 1800s, I was known as a brave and honest man. I was deeply loved by many in the town. In fact, I was one of Missouri's best lawyers. I had tremendous influence with the jury. In fact, there was one case where the gentleman I represented, everybody knew he was guilty. He had done it, and despite all the evidence that they presented and all the proof that they showed, the jury came back and said not guilty. The man was acquitted. And they asked the jurors why the decision, and they said, "Didn't John Scott ask us to bring a verdict back this way?" So, when Missouri became a territory, I was designated as the first U.S. attorney for the Missouri territory. I also approved of duels as a means of settling arguments. There was once a not too favorable newspaper article written about me, and so I challenged 5 different men to a duel before breakfast. That duel never happened. However, I was involved in a duel several years later between Thomas Crittenden and Dr. Walter Fenwick. And Dr. Walter Fenwick lived in the house on the corner opposite the cemetery with the green roof down there, you can see. And that's where Dr. Fenwick lived. So there was a duel, argument between him and Thomas Crittenden, and I was the second, or the witness for Thomas Crittenden. And the duel did not end very well for Dr. Walter Fenwick. He died in the duel. I was married in 1810. My first wife was Catherine, and we had a daughter, Elizabeth. That was in 1810. In 1815, I lost a daughter at the age of 5 from cholera. 3 months later, I lost my wife, Catherine, in childbirth, and neither she nor the baby survived. So I was a widow at that point. I settled down to my law practice, and then in 1816, I was convinced to run for Congress as a representative for Missouri Territory. And so I was involved in a very contentious election in 1816 between myself and a gentleman by the name of Rufus Easton. Now, as the election came to a close, Rufus was ahead by 7 votes. But similar to recent, there were some late votes that came in, and I ended up winning by 15. Of course I did. So this is kind of the way I dressed, because I traveled by horseback from Missouri to Washington, D.C. to accept the nomination to be a representative. And as I got there, wasn't too long behind was Mr. Rufus Easton, and he declared that and showed up declaring that there was fraud in the election. And so the Congress declared the seat vacant and sent us back to Missouri for another election. Well, in the second election, I actually won by 400 votes. So things went a little better for me that time. And that's when I actually entered my political career. This was 1816. Now, I was very instrumental in the fight for Missouri statehood. And I was reelected 4 times in the time that I served in Congress. I was very popular with my constituents. I was responsible for writing the Enabling Act of Missouri, and that led to the very contentious Missouri Compromise, which once that was decided by Congress and accepted, then that kind of cleared the way for Missouri statehood in 1821. I was pretty much known to vote the will of my constituents in almost all instances. Education was very important to me. I ended up writing part of the Constitution, especially the part that allowed for money to develop public schools in Missouri, and also gained land donated for the establishment of Missouri's first state university. Now, in 1824, I won that. That was my last election that I won. That was also the year that I married my second wife. Her name was Harriet. We lived about 5 blocks from here down by the train trestle. And that house is still standing. It was recently, or not recently, but about 5 years ago, it was completely redone. And so the house is still standing. And but my political career kind of ended in 1826. That was the year of the national election between John Quincy Adams and Andrew Jackson. And most of the state of Missouri wanted me to vote for Andrew Jackson. However, I felt that the presidency should not be given to a military man. So I was kind of friends with an elite group, I guess, in St. Louis, and they were pushing for John Quincy Adams. So I sided with them instead of most of my constituents, and that cost me my political career at that point. So I came back to St. Genevieve and kind of finished out the rest of my life as a lawyer here in town. In 1855, those of you that are from St. Genevieve, you know about our La Guione celebration. Well, in 1855, the city fathers decided that that was not a celebration that should be celebrated anymore. And so they declared that unlawful to celebrate that. Well, there were still some Frenchmen around that wanted to celebrate it. They did, and although they behaved themselves pretty well, they were brought to court by the city attorney. And so I was brought in to defend them. And I said, being the fact that has been part of our heritage for a long time, and their rights were protected under the Bill of Rights, that they should be acquitted. And they were, and the jury went to celebrate after that down into the local tavern and had a drink. I died in 1861, and some of my last words that were attributed to me was when I was close to my death, I called for a pistol. And I said, show me the man that wants to destroy this great government. And also was asked toward the end of my life if I wanted to get religion. And I said, I've served the devil all my life, and it wouldn't be right to desert him now. So that's my story, and I'm sticking to it.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
My name is Ferdinand Rosier. You may have heard the name Rozier here in St. Genevieve and other points, east, north, and south. Anyway, Rosier is the name, and I came from Nantes, France. I was born there in 1777 and died here in Sainte-Geneviève in 1864. I first arrived in your country in 1806, thereabouts, with my business partner, Jean-James Audubon. Perhaps you know that name. Audubon, the Audubon Society, you know. Yes, we were partners, and seems many people know of him and not so many know of me. But I have gotten over it. It was because our fathers were associates, business associates in France, that they sent their two sons, to your United States here to check on a piece of property that Audubon's father, Captain Audubon, owned in Pennsylvania. Mill Grove, the farm named Mill Grove in Pennsylvania, which had in recent times, at that time, there was some suggestion that there may be lead on the property, and that, you know, gave our fathers new cause for checking out how it had been, the property had been managed by Audubon's right-hand man, Mr. DaCosta, in the United States. Seems that DaCosta was always asking for more funds to meet the needs and the development of the farm, and that's how my father got involved, because Audubon's father needed resources and came to my father and said, would you like to become part of this enterprise in the new country? So that is how we became involved. So whenever Jean-James and I arrive here in the United States, our first objective is to go and check out Mill Grove Farm and see if things were in fact as DaCosta had presented them. And let us remind you, you know, back in those days, it might take a year for a letter from here to arrive, and things can happen in a year's time. So to have somebody trustworthy like myself and Audubon, right, to check up on the farm was like our father's wishes. And so when Audubon and I arrived, we already had signed a contract between the two of us that we would share all the decision making, we would share all the profits, and we would share all the losses, 50-50, equally share in whatever enterprise we established here in the United States. Like I say, the first objective was to check on the farm, but we also hoped that in time we would be able to establish an overseas trade with our fathers back in France. We providing American-made products, they providing us with French lace and perfumes and whatever else we saw a need for here. So that was the two goals that we had in mind when we first arrived. Well, in stopping at the farm and seeing the way DaCosta had, we might say, mismanaged the property, we determined that the best thing, and it did not look like the lead mining was going to be something that really would develop there. So we chose to sell our portions to DaCosta and let him take charge of the whole operation. We took our resources from the sale and then purchased additional goods that we could trade as we went, found some other place to establish our business, the Lozier and Audubon business. And so we first go to Louisville, Kentucky, but that does not strike either of us as the right place. And so we continue on down the Ohio to Henderson, Kentucky, and it had potential but not enough population for what I had in mind, at least. In the meantime, Audubon is seeming somewhat distracted to me by his drawings of the flora and the fauna and the wildlife in this new country, things that were all new to us. But did I care? Not so. But he recognized the uniqueness of these things here that you had in this country, and he started to draw them. So by the time that we arrived here in St. Genevieve, in actually then 1806, that we arrived here, he is already too distracted to really care so much about the business. He would go off in the woods while I'm managing the books. And so we eventually talk about it, and I decide that yes, I agree to buy him out. He agrees to sell his half to me, and so we dissolved the partnership, and amicably, I might add, we continued to communicate with each other throughout the rest of our life to a degree. But Audubon, he was only here for 6 weeks. everybody thinks that he, say locals, you ask them today, Audubon, oh yes, he was a resident of St. Genevieve. Yes, for 6 weeks, you call that resident. We were neither one residents yet. We were not citizens of your United States. A goal which I hope to achieve in my life, and I did. In any case, Audubon, he had left his wife and child in Henderson, Kentucky, and was, I admit, anxious to get back to them. And so that's what he would. Nonetheless, we celebrate his name here in St. Genevieve in a street named Audubon, Audubon Hotel, Audubon Senior Apartments, Audubon this, Audubon that. You see Roger, name on many things. I do say I am proud that my family name has continued to this day in places like Perryville, Missouri, where you have a Roger store. Here in Saint-Geneviève, I believe it is Rosier's Country Mart. And I do remember a time myself when there was a Rosier store on our square right here in Saint-Geneviève. And the Rosier name is still associated with many mercantile and philanthropic endeavors, a thing for which I am proud as the great patriarch of the family name. So this is my story, and I thank you for listening.
Thank you. Thank you. Come into town. While in town, he was making friends. Oh, I got one other one. Around 1780, what government controlled this area? Spain, exactly. Even though we were a Spanish town, which established in 1735, which is crowned late 1735. But after the French and Indian War, there was a Treaty of Paris. This territory, West Mississippi, became under Spanish control area, and the East End became under British control. Or they maintained, or they retained. No, actually, all area of East Mississippi came under British control. They actually acquired more land than the original colony. Given that, the Spanish government also had a military company here under the command of Lieutenant Villars. So when Celedon came in town, he was making friends with Lieutenant Villars, and he was also socializing with Mary Ann. And people, because even though there was two separate governments, people socialized. So people from here would go over the Fort de Chartres, and they would socialize with people at Fort de Chartres. And Lieutenant Villars was one of them, Mary Ann was one of them, Celedon. And while they were over there that evening, Celedon forms alliance with this Indian guy, who was basically just a slave for the British soldiers. And so later on, apparently one night he goes over, takes her, brings her back over to the west side of the Mississippi River, and at some point in time, some form of accident, she had been shot because hunters were out exploring whatever. They find her body in a shallow grave and find that she had actually been shot. So the prime suspect was Celedon. They sent out a posse looking for him. They never were able to find him. But needless to say, Francois Valle, the commandant at the time, starts an investigation or a trial because of Celedon's relationship with Lieutenant Villars. The Spanish military also starts their own investigation because they want to make sure that Villars, or if there was any involvement from their lieutenant. So they're having this investigation. They're interviewing different people, and one of the people they interviewed is Mary Ann, the slave of little Elizabeth Overshaw.
During this investigation, they decided to throw her in irons. Up to that time, she was, there was no one, but for some reason they threw her in irons. So when she had her quarters with Elizabeth Beauvais, Celadon sneaks into town one night, and he visits her. He convinces her to leave with him. During this process, she's actually trying to also convince her son to go too. Marianne actually had two sons. One of them was really young, and they probably figured that he couldn't travel with them. He would travel well. And she tries to convince her older son to leave with him, but he says, "I cannot leave together." So he stays behind, Celadon and Marianne. They leave out of town. There's still investigations going on. They actually and we know because of this that we know some of the facts. Is they interviewed the two sons. They interviewed hunters, and they testified that Celadon actually had a hair trigger rifle, and which had a bearing in the investigation. So it's conceivable it might have been an accident. And the gal was actually shot accidentally, which is conceivable because if you go to all that much trouble and you want to have a partner or mate with you, you don't want to shoot.
Right.
So I guess you could say Marianne ended up being a substitute. Substitute. But who knows? Given the circumstances, the iron, that convinces her to leave. The investigation is actually closed in. It was ruled as an accident. Celadon was never brought to trial. He was never tried for murder. The only thing he was technically guilty of was theft, because Marianne was a slave. And we do know, based from the records, that apparently later on, Celadon did tell some of the visiting hunters. They actually left town, but they had a camp along the Black River, area. So what's that now? Lesterville and then he said that he was willing to make restitution, and for the value of Marianne. Of course, that was not. But the hunters also said that when visiting Marianne and Celadon, she would always inquire about her sons and how well they were doing. And she'd actually been brought up as Christian, so one of the things she emphasized to make sure that they're brought up in a Christian environment. We do know, based on census records, that the two sons went to Antoine Thomas III, which was Elizabeth's son. But then after that, history just kind of history. So, but that's one of the things involving ancestors.
Yeah. Well, thank you.
You're welcome.
Very nice.
Thank you. Hope you enjoyed the evening. So.
Yes.
Let me introduce myself. My name is Robbins, Prospect K. Robbins. I was born in Pittsfield, Massachusetts in 1872. I always heard of this westward expansion that the United States was involved in, and it always intrigued me. So in 1810, I moved to St. Charles. I was a school teacher. I actually taught surveying. I was elected to county surveyor, and I was justice of the peace. In 1813, I enlisted in Callaway's company of Rangers, and I reached the rank of first lieutenant. And in May of 1815, I was discharged. A few weeks after my discharge, I received a letter from a gentleman by the name of William Rector. He was the deputy surveyor for the Upper Louisiana Territory. He requested a meeting. A couple days later, I left for St. Louis and met up with Mr. Rector. At that meeting, I met a gentleman by the name of Joseph C. Brown. He was a pretty well-known surveyor. He had surveyed quite a bit of land over in Illinois. Mr. Rector informed us that he had a little bit of survey work for us to do. It seems like the United States had purchased 828,000 square miles for $15 million from France. They needed to sell the land. In order to sell the land, they had to have it described. We were the start of the original survey of Louisiana Purchase. Per Mr. Rector's instructions, we were to gather a crew, 2 axemen, 2 chainmen, a cook, instrument men. We gather our supplies, our equipment. Our equipment consisted of a compass. The compass was to be of David Rittenhauser construction. Mr. Rittenhauser was a maker of fine scientific instruments back then. We were to gather a chain. This chain was what we were to measure the line with. My line was a north-south line. The compass was to keep us running north. Mr. Brown's line was an east-west line. The compass was to keep him running west. We were to measure that line. We were to meet later that fall in the bank of the Mississippi River. And we did. We loaded up our equipment, our crew, our supplies on a flat-bottom boat, headed south. We got down to the St. Francis River. Mr. Brown got out and made his camp. I floated on down to the Arkansas River, made camp. On October the 27th, Mr. Brown headed west, using his compass to keep him going west. I headed north, using the compass to keep me north. On November the 10th, I intersected Mr. Brown's line. We had just established what's described as the initial point. The line I was running is considered the 5th principal meridian. Mr. Brown's line is considered a baseline.
My God.
All the deeds in Arkansas, Missouri, Iowa, North Dakota, half of South Dakota is all based on that point. We were to measure that line. The idea of the United States was going to survey off everything in square miles. 80 chains is a mile. This is 66 feet. It's 100 links. 80 of them make a mile. But they also wanted to mark every half mile. So every 40 chains, we'd set a post, mark witness trees. The compass was keeping us going north. The axemen were out there in front, chopping down all the vegetation. We have 11 chaining pins. Everyone wants to know why 11. 10 would be a more even number. But the 11th pin is used where we start. You'd have a chaining pin setting on the ground where you started. The 4 chainmen would have 10 pins. We'd stretch the chain out, hold it level, keep it tight. I was holding, the rear chainman would be holding over the pin at his feet. I'd yell chain, 4 chainmen would drop a chaining pin. I'd pick up the chaining pin at my foot, walk up to where he was, stretch the chain out again, hold it level, hold it tight. Yell chain, the 4 chainmen would drop another chaining pin. When he would drop his 10th chaining pin, he'd be out. He would yell out. To help keep track, every time he yelled out, I'd take a bead, throw it over my shoulder. If we knew how many outs we had, we knew how many chains we had. 40 chains, set a post, mark witness trees. 80 chains, that would be the mile, set a post, mark witness trees. There was other surveyors coming right behind us, but they would take off of our mile markers to start laying out the square miles. After 317 miles and 56 chains, we reached the Missouri River. That was on December 28th. We rested for a couple days, gathered up all my notes, headed back to St. Charles, organized everything, headed back into St. Louis, gave everything back to Mr. Rector. Job was over. I went back to St. Charles, and in 1816 I married my wife, Elizabeth Evans. We had 2 children, Jesse and Charles. 1820s we moved down here to St. Genevieve. Charles grew up to be the county coroner. He eventually moved back up to St. Charles. Jesse was an attorney, circuit clerk and recorder, and later he was the state rep for this area. If you're familiar with St. Genevieve, just west of the post office downtown, at the corner of the street, is the Jesse B. Robbins house. The date, I think, is 1863. My wife always wanted me to be baptized, so in May of 1847 I was baptized. June 3rd, 1847 I died. I'm buried somewhere in the cemetery.
We lived there.